About this episode, you are going to hear. The timing of it is amazing to me. When I outlined this trajectory of podcasts, starting with the General Welfare Clause, moving to the New Leviathan, and then Empire of Liberty, I had a plan. And the plan was to take readers of the articles and viewers and listeners of the podcast through a journey that would start with our founders and our idea of liberty and how that evolved over the centuries to where we are today, an imperial power. The General Welfare Clause focuses on the legislation and the court cases that took us from 1776 through to the 1980s. The New Leviathan focuses on the national security state that would evolve from the 1990s to present day. Both of those were focused mostly on domestic issues. The Empire Liberty series, the series that we are on episode 9 of today, this was focused on the foreign policy. And so as I outlined this timeline, and as this episode, episode 9, was to fall on March 7th, 2026, I had no idea, none, that this would be the week that we would be launching a war against Iran. So it is very important with that backdrop that we understand how the war with Iran actually started 53 years ago. This episode goes into great detail talking about the coup that was orchestrated by our own American government against a democratically elected leader. And then along with that, the lessons, the takeaways that our government, that our clandestine agencies would use and would follow from that template.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
In August 1953, a man named Kermit Roosevelt Jr. sat in a basement in Tehran, directing the overthrow of a democratically elected government. Roosevelt was the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, the man who had taken Panama. Now the grandson was taking Iran. The operation cost less than $1 million. It took less than a month, and it installed a dictator who ruled for 26 years. And it set in motion a chain of consequences that Americans are still paying for today. The 1979 hostage crisis, when Iranian students held 52 Americans for 444 days, baffled most Americans. Why do they hate us? What did we do? Well, the answer begins in that basement in Tehran in 1953. Operation Ajax, the CIA's code name for it, or Operation Boot, as British intelligence called it, established the template for American regime change that would be applied again and again. Guatemala, the Congo, Chile, and beyond. Identify a target government, frame it as a communist threat, recruit local assets, create chaos, install a friendly dictator, and declare victory for freedom. The template worked in the short term, but it produced catastrophe in the long term. But here's what makes the Iran story particularly instructive. The coup was not primarily about communism. It was about oil, specifically British Petroleum's desire to maintain its monopoly over Iranian petroleum. The United States was recruited into the British Imperial Project. It executed it successfully and inherited the consequences when Britain could no longer sustain its position. Of course, we are still inheriting its consequences. What started as a nuclear standoff with Iran, the designation of it as part of the axis of evil, 4 decades of sanctions, of threats, and near wars leading to the hot war that we are in right now. All of it traces back to those days in August when America decided it could remake nations from the shadows. This episode examines how the coup happened, who made it happen, and what it tells us about the nature of covert action, its seductions, its methods, and its inevitable blowback. We will also examine the Iran operation reveals about the dangers of intelligence services operating without oversight. The same secrecy that enables covert action also enables catastrophic betrayal. The founders warned against foreign entanglements. They could not have imagined the entanglements we were about to create. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 9 of the series Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, Kermit's Game, Iran 1953, and the template for regime change. This episode begins part 4 of the series, the CIA and Covert Empire. We move from the institutional architecture examined in our previous episodes to the operations that architecture enabled. The National Security Act of 1947 created the CIA. Iran in 1953 showed exactly what the CIA could do. This episode also corresponds to Article 9 of our written series, published last Sunday on our Substack page. But the podcast expands on that article's themes, particularly in discussing the Dulles brothers' wartime background and the broader implications of intelligence agencies operating in the shadows. As always, the podcast provides additional primary sources and addresses complexities that the written format cannot fully explore. Let us begin. There's a couple of texts that I'm going to promote here in this episode. Not a paid promotion, by the way. Although, if the authors would like to compensate me, I'd be very happy to oblige them. I want to talk about the first book I want to actually mention is The Prize by Daniel Yergin. New York Times bestseller, winner of the Pulitzer Prize. This book is a couple decades old now. There's a follow-up book called The New Map that he did. But this book does a great job of explaining the foundation, the growth of the oil industry from its beginnings just up the road from where I am in Oil City, Pennsylvania, to its global impact. The politics, the business, the growth of an industry that nobody knew what it was going to be and turned out to be very beneficial for the world, obviously, in the way that its energy has produced outcomes to help the world grow and change and evolve, but also very detrimental to the world when you talk about the global politics involved with it. So a great book, The Prize by Daniel Yergin. The other book that I will talk about in this episode is The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot, a New York Times bestseller. This really focuses on the Dulles brothers, which we will talk about a little bit later in the section. So these two books, if you got a chance, if you want to put them onto your reading list or ask for it as a gift or give it as a gift, these are great books. The Prize by Daniel Yergin and The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. Both of those I highly recommend. Okay, so let's get into this episode. And really, I want to begin to really understand what happened in Iran in 1953. We must first understand what the British had built there. and why they were determined to keep it. As I mentioned with that preview with the book, The Prize, one of the things you learn in that book is British interest in Iranian oil began in 1901 when a British financier named William Knox D'Arcy obtained a sweeping concession from the Persian government. And the terms he got were extraordinary. Exclusive rights to prospect for and extract petroleum across most of the country for 60 years. This is 1901. The Persian government, the world, had no idea how valuable oil would become. None. No concept. Not have any idea. In fact, oil was discovered in commercial quantities in 1908. So Iran didn't even know what they had at the time that this concession was made. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed, and later it was renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and later still, British Petroleum, the company we know today as BP. The terms of the concession were extraordinarily favorable to Britain. Iran received roughly 16% of the profits from its own oil. The company refused to open its books for Iranian inspections, so that percentage was calculated on figures the Iranians could not verify. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company became the largest British overseas asset. Iranian oil fueled the Royal Navy, the instrument of British global power. Without Iranian oil, Britain could not maintain its empire. Churchill is famous in World War I for introducing oil to the Royal Navy. And of course, it fueled it throughout the rest of World War I and into World War II. The company town of Abadan, the site of the world's largest refinery, embodied the colonial relationship. British employees lived in comfort. Gardens, swimming pools, social clubs. Some of those clubs had signs at the entrance, and the signs read, "No dogs were Iranians." Iranian workers lived in slums without running water. British engineers earned salaries that dwarfed what Iranian engineers received for the same work. The wealth beneath Iranian soil flowed to London, while Iranians remained poor. This is not an anti-capitalist rant at all, certainly not for me. But it is what you look at how the nations evolved, how Britain profited versus Iran profiting, how their people, the British people versus the Iranian people, doing the same work. That was a disparity. And it was a disparity that was enabled by force, by this contract, not by free will, not by competitive marketplace dynamics, by a contract that was agreed to in 1901. And this was an ancient history. This was the 1940s and 1950s. Iranians could see what was happening. The comparison was inescapable. In 1950, the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, agreed to a 50-50 profit split with Saudi Arabia. Venezuela had similar arrangements. Iran asked for the same, a 50-50 split on Iranian oil. Britain refused. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's position was that the 1901 concession was a contract, and contracts must be honored. That the contract had been signed by a desperate monarch under British pressure that predated the oil industry's importance, that every other oil-producing nation was receiving better terms, none of this mattered to London. And so into this situation stepped Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was an aristocrat, a Swiss-educated lawyer, and a nationalist politician who had opposed foreign influence in Iran for decades. He was emphatically not a communist. He was a liberal nationalist in the European tradition. committed to constitutional government and suspicious of the Soviet Union. In April 1951, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, unanimously voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company. The Shah, pressured by popular sentiment, appointed Mossadegh prime minister to implement the decision. Time magazine named Mossadegh its Man of the Year for 1951. The American press initially portrayed him sympathetically, not as a villain, but as the embodiment of nationalist aspiration sweeping the colonial world. He was elderly, emotional, given to conducting meetings from his bed. He was also enormously popular with the Iranian people. The nationalization was legal under international law. Iran offered compensation for the physical assets. Mexico has nationalized its oil industry in 1938, and the United States accepted the principle that nations could nationalize foreign assets with fair payment. Iran was exercising sovereignty over resources within its own territory. Britain did not see it that way. Britain responded with economic warfare designed to strangle Iran into submission. The Royal Navy was deployed to prevent tankers from loading Iranian oil. British technicians withdrew from Abadan, crippling production. Britain organized an international boycott. No Western company would buy Iranian oil, refine it, or transport it. Iran's oil revenues collapsed. The economy suffered. Britain's strategy was simple. Make the Iranian people suffer until they removed Mossadegh and reversed nationalization. But economic pressure was not enough. Britain wanted regime change. The problem was that Britain, exhausted from World War II, losing its empire piece by piece, lacked the capacity to execute a coup by itself. Britain needed America.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning. Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from general welfare to the new Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
Britain approached the Truman administration in 1952, requesting American assistance in overthrowing Mossadegh. The request was refused. President Truman and Secretary of State Dean Atkinson viewed Mossadegh as a legitimate nationalist, not a communist puppet. They saw the dispute as a matter of British imperial interest, not American security. The United States attempted to mediate between Britain and Iran, proposing various compromise solutions. Britain rejected them all. Truman's refusal demonstrated that the coup was not inevitable. A different American president, though, made a different choice. Everything changed in January 1953 when Dwight Eisenhower was inaugurated. The new administration brought in new men with different assumptions and with histories that shaped those assumptions in ways the public did not understand. John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State. His brother, Allen Dulles, became the Director of Central Intelligence. Understanding who these men were and what they had done is essential to understanding the Iran coup and everything that followed. The Dulles brothers came from Wall Street, specifically Sullivan and Cromwell. one of the most powerful corporate law firms in America. Their clients included major banks, oil companies, and industrial corporations with interests across the globe. Before the war, World War II, Sullivan and Cromwell had represented German corporations closely tied to the Nazi regime, including IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that would later manufacture Zyklon B for the death camps. John Foster Dulles had been the firm's managing partner and personally handled German accounts into the late 1930s. This was not merely legal work. The Dulles brothers moved in a world where corporate interest, government policy, and covert action merged seamlessly. They genuinely believed, that what was good for American business was good for America, and that both were good for the world. And this worldview would shape American foreign policy for a decade. Allen Dulles' experience in World War II proved formative for the methods he would later employ as CIA director. During the war, Dulles served as the Office of Strategic Services station chief in Bern, Switzerland. It was a neutral listening post where intelligence from across Europe flowed. From his base at Herrengasse 23, Dulles ran agents, gathered intelligence, and conducted the kind of shadow diplomacy that would become his specialty. His most controversial wartime operation was codenamed Sunrise. Secret negotiations with SS General Karl Wolff for the surrender of German forces in Italy. Dulles conducted these negotiations without authorization from Washington. He was freelancing, making deals with Nazi commanders on his own initiative. The Soviets were furious. They suspected, not without reason, that America was cutting a separate peace with Hitler's generals. The operation succeeded in securing German surrender in Italy days before the general capitulation. But it established a pattern that would define Dulles' career. He would act independently, without oversight, pursuing objectives he defined himself. More significantly, Dulles began during the war what would become a central feature of Cold War intelligence: the recruitment of former Nazis as American assets. Even before Germany's surrender, Dulles was identifying German intelligence officers whose knowledge of the Soviet Union might prove useful. Ideology was secondary to utility. Men who had served Hitler could serve Washington if they possessed valuable information. The most important of these recruits was Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's intelligence chief for the Eastern Front. Gehlen had built extensive networks of agents within the Soviet Union. As Germany collapsed, he buried files, surrendered to American forces, and offered his services. Dulles recognized the value. Gehlen and his organization were absorbed into American intelligence. They eventually became the nucleus of West Germany's post-war intelligence services, the BND. The implications were profound. America was allying with men who had served a genocidal regime, not reluctantly, not as a last resort, but eagerly and as a first choice. The principle established was simple. Anyone who opposed communism was useful, regardless of what else they had done. And this principle would guide Operation Paperclip's recruitment of Nazi scientists. It would guide the CIA's collaboration with war criminals across Europe, and it would guide the agency's willingness to work with dictators, torturers, and death squads throughout the Cold War. As historian David Talbot documented in The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles emerged from the war convinced that the real enemy has always been the Soviet Union, not Nazi Germany. The war against Hitler had been a detour. The war against Stalin was the main event. And this conviction shaped everything that followed. The Dulles brothers viewed the world through a particular lens forged in history. Neutralism was pro-Soviet. Any government that did not align firmly with the United States was opening the door to communism. Any leader who sought to balance between East and West was, at best, naive. At worst, a communist fellow traveler. This worldview left no room for legitimate nationalism. Mossadegh's attempts to maintain Iranian independence from both superpowers, his refusal to join anti-Soviet alliances, his acceptance of some communist support in parliament, all marked him as a threat. That he was a liberal Democrat, that he had suppressed the Communist Tudeh Party, that he had represented precisely the kind of modern nationalism America should have cultivated, none of this registered. And Britain recognized the opportunity. So the pitch was reframed. This was not about oil. This was about communism. Mossadegh was unstable. Iran was heading toward chaos. If Mossadegh fell, the communists would take over. The Tudeh Party, Iran's Communist Party, did exist. It had some popular support, but it was not dominant, and Mossadegh was not their ally. The intelligence assessments did not support the claim that Iran was about to go communist. But the Cold War frame was irresistible. The Eisenhower administration approved Operation Ajax. The pattern was established. Economic interest plus anti-communist framing equals intervention justified. The actual American interest, containing its Soviet expansion, was grafted onto British interest, preserving oil monopoly to produce policy. This formula would repeat throughout the Cold War. Guatemala, the Congo, Chile, Indonesia, the same pattern, different countries. Kermit Roosevelt, Kim to his colleagues, arrived in Tehran to direct the coup from the ground. The plan involved multiple elements. Bribe politicians to abandon Mossadegh. Bribe military officers to support the coup. Bribe journalists and clerics to spread propaganda. And then organize street mobs to create the appearance of popular uprising. Sound familiar? We've seen it deployed again and again and again since. The Shah would sign firmans, royal decrees, dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi as prime minister. The military would enforce the decrees. The deed would be done. On the night of August 15th to 16th, 1953, the plan was set in motion. The Shah signed the decrees. An officer was dispatched to deliver the dismissal order to Mossadegh. The officer was arrested. Mossadegh had been warned. He went on national radio to announce that a coup had been attempted against the constitutional government of Iran. The Shah panicked. He fled to Baghdad, then to Rome, where he waited in exile, expecting never to return. CIA headquarters in Washington considered the operation a failure. They sent word to abort. Kermit Roosevelt refused. What happened over the next 3 days demonstrated both the methods of covert action and their dependence on chaos. Roosevelt spent money freely. CIA funds flowed to military officers, politicians, and street organizers. Mobs were hired, both communist mobs that would rampage through Tehran, frightening the middle class, and royalist mobs that would demand the Shah's return. The chaos was deliberate. The goal was to create disorder so severe that military intervention would seem necessary, even welcome. On August 19th, pro-Shah forces converged on Mossadegh's residence. Military units that had been bribed to join the assault, after hours of fighting, Mossadegh surrendered. General Zahedi emerged from hiding to assume the prime ministership, and the Shah returned in triumph. The coup had succeeded. The methods employed in Iran would become standard CIA procedure. Bribery was central. Politicians, military officers, journalists, religious figures, anyone whose support could be purchased was purchased. Blackmail was also used. Now, the amounts were modest by government standards, but the effects were decisive. Propaganda was persuasive. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, newspaper articles, all manufactured to create the impression of popular opposition to Mossadegh. False flag operations attributed violence to communists, making Mossadegh appear either complicit or helpless. Mob violence was organized. The spontaneous demonstrations that provided cover for the coup were nothing of the sort. Participants were paid. The crowds were manufactured. They were organized and transported to events. The total cost was approximately $1 million, equivalent to perhaps $10 million today. For this price, America changed the government of a strategically vital nation. The template was established. Identify the target government, frame it as communist or threatening to American interest, recruit local assets in the military, politics, and media through bribery or blackmail, create chaos and instability, and install the preferred alternative, and then declare victory for democracy and freedom? Less than a year later, the template was applied again in Guatemala. Operation PB Success overthrew the democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. His crime was land reform that threatened the United Fruit Company, a corporation whose lawyers had included John Foster and Allen Dulles. 2 successful coups in 2 years. The template worked, or appeared to. The CIA's reputation soared. Covert action became the preferred instrument of American foreign policy. The long-term consequences in both countries were decades away. Success bred overconfidence. Mohammad Reza Shah returned to Iran not as a constitutional monarch, but as an absolute ruler. The coup had demonstrated that he held power through American support, not popular legitimacy. He would never forget. Neither would the Iranian people. Mossadegh was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by house arrest until his death in 1967. He never recanted. His final statement at trial expressed the conviction that history would vindicate him. The Shah moved quickly to eliminate opposition. In 1957, with American and Israeli assistance, he created SAVAK, the Organization of Intelligence and National Security. SAVAK became one of the most brutal secret police forces in the world. Torture, assassination, pervasive surveillance. CIA officers helped train its agents. The Iranian people learned to fear their own government, and they learned who had put that government in place. A new oil agreement was negotiated. American companies, excluded before the coup, now had access to Iranian oil. And here's the bitter irony. The final settlement included a 50-50 profit split. Exactly what Mossadegh had requested. Exactly what Britain had refused. The coup had been fought to prevent what was ultimately conceded. The difference was that under Mossadegh, Iranian oil would have remained in Iranian hands. Under the Consortium, it remained in Western hands. For 26 years, the Shah ruled as an American ally. His regime combined modernization with repression in ways that would prove explosive. The White Revolution brought land reform, literacy campaigns, women's suffrage. Iran modernized rapidly. The Shah imagined himself a progressive monarch leading his people toward the future. But modernization was imposed from above, against the wishes of traditional communities. The speed of change dislocated millions. The benefits flowed to those connected to the regime. And underlying everything was SAVAK. Political opposition was impossible. Dissidents were tortured. The forms of constitutional government existed. The reality was dictatorship. By the late 1970s, the contradictions had become unsustainable. Opposition coalesced around Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric exiled in 1964 for opposing the Shah and American influence. From Iraq and then France, Khomeini became the symbol of resistance. In January 1979, the Shah fled Iran, never to return. In February, Khomeini arrived in Tehran to millions of cheering supporters. The revolution explicitly invoked 1953. Iranians knew what Americans had forgotten. Their democratic government had been overthrown by the CIA. The Shah had been imposed by foreign powers. 26 years of dictatorship, 26 years of SAVAK, all trace back to Operation Ajax. The revolution was, in part, revenge. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students seized the American embassy. 52 Americans would be held for 444 days. The students' stated grievance was specific. They feared the United States would repeat 1953. The Shah had been admitted to America for medical treatment. The revolutionaries believed this was preparation for another coup. American television showed footage of blindfolded hostages and burning American flags. The nightly news counted the days of captivity. The hostage crisis consumed the ending days of the Carter presidency. Most Americans were bewildered. What had we done to deserve this hatred? The answer, obvious to Iranians, was invisible to Americans. The coup that had shaped Iranian history was unknown in the country that had executed it. The blowback had arrived 26 years after Operation Ajax. And it continues. The Iran-Iraq war, support for Hezbollah, the nuclear standoff, every confrontation between America and Iran traces back to that Tehran basement where Kermit Roosevelt directed the overthrow of Iranian democracy. The Iran coup demonstrated what covert action could accomplish. But the world of secret intelligence contains dangers that its practitioners often fail to recognize until catastrophe arrives. The same secrecy that enables covert action also enables covert betrayal. Consider this. While the CIA was building its capacity for regime change, while Allen Dulles was recruiting former Nazis and overthrowing governments, The agency was being penetrated by enemies it did not detect. Kim Philby. Harold Adrian Russell Philby. Kim to his friends, the same nickname as Kermit Roosevelt, was one of the most senior officers in British intelligence. In the early 1950s, he served as MI6's liaison to the CIA in Washington. He attended the same meetings. He read the same cables. He knew the same secrets. He was also a Soviet agent. Philby had been recruited by Soviet intelligence while at Cambridge in the 1930s. For over 2 decades, he rose through British intelligence while passing everything he learned to Moscow. He was part of the Cambridge Five, a ring of Soviet agents embedded at the highest levels of British government. During his time in Washington, Philby had access to the most sensitive Anglo-American intelligence operations. He knew about covert actions being planned. He knew about the identities of agents. He knew the methods being developed. And he reported it all to the KGB. The implications are staggering. The same intelligence services that were overthrowing governments in Iran and Guatemala, that were recruiting former Nazis, that were operating without meaningful oversight, these services were penetrated by the enemy they claimed to be fighting. Philby eventually defected to Moscow in 1963, one step ahead of exposure. He lived out his days in the Soviet Union, decorated and honored by the regime he had served. Philby was not an anomaly. The pattern repeated. Aldrich Ames was a CIA counterintelligence officer. His job was to catch Soviet spies within the agency. From 1985 to 1994, he was himself a Soviet spy. Ames compromised more than 100 intelligence operations. He revealed the identities of every CIA agent working inside the Soviet Union. At least 10 of those agents were executed. Others were imprisoned. The damage was catastrophic. The CIA's entire network inside the Soviet Union was rolled up. Years of intelligence collection were rendered worthless. Men who had risked their lives trusting American promises were killed because an American officer sold them for money. Ames received approximately $4.6 million from the KGB. He bought a house with cash, drove a Jaguar, and his colleagues noticed nothing for nearly a decade. The agency that overthrew governments could not detect a traitor in its own ranks. What do Philby and Ames tell us about the world of covert intelligence? First, that secrecy is a double-edged sword. The compartmentalization that enables covert operations also prevents accountability. When agencies operate in the dark, no one can see what they are doing, including whether or not they have been compromised. Second, that oversight is not weakness. The founders understood that power must be checked. The CIA was designed to operate outside normal checks. The result was not greater security, but greater vulnerability. Third, that the confidence of intelligence agencies in their own capabilities is often misplaced. The CIA believed it could reshape the politics of nations, but it could not even secure its own communications. The Iran operation succeeded in the short term, but we must ask at what cost and with what reliability. The same agency that installed the Shah also missed the Islamic Revolution. The same agency that overthrew Mossadegh failed to predict the hostage crisis. The same agency that prided itself on covert action was penetrated by Soviet agents for decades. This is not an argument against intelligence gathering. Nations need to understand threats, but it's an argument against the unchecked covert action that the national security state enabled. The founders feared standing armies because permanent military establishment create constituencies for permanent war. They should have also feared the permanent intelligence establishments for the same reason, and for another reason they could not have anticipated. Agencies that operate in the dark can be turned, and no one will know until the damage is done. What does Iran in 1953 teach us? The coup established regime change as a routine instrument of American policy. Before 1953, the United States had not systematically overthrown foreign governments. After 1953, it became normal, a tool available whenever policymakers decided that a foreign leader was inconvenient. The coup established a formula: economic interests dressed as ideological justification. The stated reason for intervention was rarely the actual reason. Oil companies, fruit companies, mining companies, their interests were protected while the public was told that communism was being contained. The coup demonstrated that America would install dictators and call it stability. The Shah was a dictator, but he was our dictator, and his repression was order. And the coup revealed that the fundamental flaw in covert action: it assumes the consequences can be controlled, that $1 million and a few weeks of chaos can reshape a society. The blowback is someone else's problem. 26 years of dictatorship produced 45 years of hostility and counting. The coup did not prevent radicalization. It caused it. We did not avoid making an enemy. We created one. The question is not whether the coup succeeded in its immediate objectives. It did. The question is whether the consequences, fully traced, made America safer or more at risk. The evidence clearly speaks for itself. Next Sunday, Article 10 continues with Part 4, The Quiet Americans, CIA operations from Cuba to Chile. We will examine Operation Paperclip's recruitment of Nazi scientists, Operation Mockingbird's infiltration of American media, and the covert campaigns across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The template established in Iran would be applied again and again, with consequences we are still discovering. On Tuesday, our contemporary application episode will examine how the patterns established in 1953 continue to shape American policy toward Iran today, from the nuclear negotiations to the current war. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been Episode 9 of Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. Here you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussion, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until then, have a great day.